In this video, we're going to cover 100 years of running backs. Now, breaking things down by decade is by no means a perfect way to do this. I look at it as more of a peek into every era of football. For a lot of these older decades, I should warn you, there's very little existing footage of these players. So in order to pick who was the best, I went back and spent hours reading old newspaper archives to see what the people said who actually witnessed these guys play year in and year out. So this video was certainly a learning mission for me, and I hope it can be for all of you as well. The NFL's origins go back as far as 1920. But if this list included the 1910s, then Jim Thorpe would be the pick. By the start of the 20s though, Thorpe was 33. His best days were behind him, although he was still recognized with a first-team selection in 1923. Another legend in Red Grange can also be left out, partially due to injuries. Chicago's Patty Driscoll also deserves to be mentioned. On offense, he had success playing quarterback and halfback. Next, the more I research Vern Llewellyn, the more I believe he's maybe the Hall of Fame's most outrageous omission. He was selected to 4 straight All-Pro teams in the late 20s. When he retired, he held the NFL record for touchdowns, and he helped lead the Packers to 3 straight championships. No doubt one of the best players of his era and a contender for this title. Ultimately, I went with Duluth Eskimos fullback Ernie Nevers. The argument against Nevers is his lack of time playing pro football in the 20s. However, many of the best players this decade share that same issue. In 1926, Nevers began the year pitching against Ty Cobb in the MLB. Then he stepped into pro football and immediately became the best fullback in the game. After a temporary football retirement, he came back in 1929 for the Cardinals and set multiple long-lasting records, including 6 rushing TDs in one game. He was dominant every year he played and was part of the Hall of Fame's inaugural class. Ernie Nevers retired in 1932, saying he wanted to get out of the game in one piece after breaking his wrist. Red Grange re-emerged early in the decade with a couple of terrific seasons. Giants fullback Ken Strawn and Redskins tailback Cliff Battles each led their respective teams to a championship, along with spectacular individual seasons. But maybe the 3 biggest contenders for this award all came from our modern-day NFC North. Packers fullback Clark Hinkle played at a high level throughout the decade. Bears fullback Bronko Nagurski is rightfully the biggest legend of the decade. He's maybe the best blocking fullback ever. After all, he blocked his teammate Beatty Feathers to the NFL's first 1,000-yard season and a record 8.4 yards per carry. Nagurski's running was also top tier, as well as his play on the D-line. Now our final player is Dutch Clark. You could argue Nagurski was a better overall two-way player than Clark, but exclusively as a runner, I lean toward Clark. If you're diving into historic newspapers, then you'll see Clark is actually listed as a quarterback. But don't let that fool you. So Clark called the plays like a QB would, but he also ran the ball better than maybe anyone this decade. That's why he was the only running back from the 20s or 30s to make the NFL 100 team. In 1932, one writer called Clark the best player of his time and rated his running ability as better than Nevers. Red Grange called him the hardest man in football to tackle. If MVP awards were given, then Clark would have had a serious argument for multiple years while leading some great Lions teams. The winning was there, the overall stats beat all his adversaries. Ultimately, Clark is the pick for the 1930s. Spec Sanders is one of those players you wish the world could have seen more of. His pro career didn't begin until the age of 28 due to World War II. Then he put together a great 3-year stretch for the Yankees in the All-America Football Conference, had a knee operation that sidelined him for a year, then he only played defense for one final year, and retired. Now overall in the 40s, two backs really separated from the pack, and both have gone down as two of the greatest to ever play. First up, Marion Motley also had a delayed start to his career due to Navy obligations. He then became one of 4 players to break Pro Football's 13-year color barrier in 1946. For his first year playing for the Browns, he averaged an unreal 8.2 yards per carry. To this day, he still owns the highest yards per carry by running back for a career in NFL history. The other separator was Eagles running back Steve Van Buren. In 1947 and 1949, Van Buren broke the NFL's season rushing yards record. He also led the Eagles to 2 championships, including the 1948 title game where he scored the game's only points. His other championship performance gained 196 yards on the ground. In total, he had 5 first-team selections in the 40s. When he retired, he held the record for most career rushing yards and touchdowns. No doubt a legend of the game, and my pick for the best of the 40s. Browns fullback Jim Brown entered the league in 1957 and became the best threat out of the backfield the sport had ever seen. But he only played 3 seasons this decade. Although he won MVP in 2 out of those 3 seasons, we're going to save him for the 60s and focus on the other great backs who played for a longer time this decade. Giants All-Pro Frank Gifford is arguably the best dual-threat back of the 50s. But his rushing production isn't quite up to par when measured against the other elite players he's compared to. Cardinals' Ollie Madsen had Olympic-level speed and was another first-rate pass catcher and runner. And our final 2 candidates shared the same 49ers backfield. Hugh McElhenney lined up as a halfback in what became known as the $1 Million backfield. He was no stranger to the All-Pro team, and his vision was so extraordinary that he was said to have eyes in the back of his head. His partner was fullback Joe Perry, who became the first player to ever rush for over 1,000 rushing yards in back-to-back years. And partially due to that, he won MVP in 1954. Although he was undersized for a fullback, he made up for it with lightning-fast speed and elusiveness. He led the decade in rushing yards and touchdowns, and in my opinion has a slight edge over his peers, although you can't go wrong with one of those guys either. In the early 60s, 2 Packers legends shared the backfield and won back-to-back MVPs, Paul Hornung and Jim Taylor. Colts halfback Lenny Moore, we could have mentioned him in the 50s, but for right here, he was like a modern-day receiving back and was dominant at it. Bears halfback Gale Sayers is one of the best players we've mentioned so far today, but unfortunately he played in the same decade as Jim Brown. Still, Sayers was the best back in the second half of this decade and is easily one of the best to ever play the position. Meanwhile, Jim Brown is considered by many to be the best running back to ever suit up. To this day, he's the only player to ever average over 100 rushing yards a game for an entire career. In his 9 years in the league, he was voted first-team All-Pro 8 times. He led Cleveland to their last NFL title in 1964. When he retired, he owned the 3 seasons in history with the most rushing yards. That included a bonkers 1963 where he demolished the season record by over 300 yards. At this point in time, he was the best player to step foot on an NFL field, regardless of position. Before we transition to the 70s, I have to mention the man who replaced Brown. Leroy Kelly led the league in rushing TDs for 3 straight years and replaced a legend in the best way possible. Franco Harris didn't have the production of the other top rushers of the 70s, but he was the ultimate winner of this bunch. As a big piece of the Steelers' dynasty, Harris won a Super Bowl MVP award and caught the Immaculate Reception ball. It always seemed like a guarantee that Harris would rush for over 1,000 yards and the Steelers would be in contention for a championship. Dolphins fullback Larry Zonka was tough as nails and will always be remembered for his role in Miami's undefeated season. Earl Campbell only played 2 seasons in the 70s, but he had one of the best starts to a career ever. Walter Payton was the best running back in the back half of the decade. In 1977, he won MVP. That year included a flu game where he put up a then-record 275 rushing yards. Part of what made him so great was his irregular motion. He had a high stutter step that made it harder for tacklers to predict his movements. If a defender did manage to hit him, then he embraced the contact. Really, his only weakness for taking the 70s is his career starting in 1975. Ultimately, the pick for this decade had to be Bills running back O.J. Simpson. In 1972, O.J. led the league with 1,251 rushing yards. The next year, he became the first player to ever rush for over 2,000 yards. A monumental feat, as he is the only player in history to hit that mark in just 14 games. Of course, he was named MVP that year. 1975 was arguably even better. He had 23 total touchdowns and more yards from scrimmage. We all know what happened after his career, but strictly on the field, his 5-year peak stands as one of the best for any running back in history. Although Roger Craig and John Riggins had different play styles, they both contributed to championship teams and should be remembered as a big part of the NFL in the 80s. Marcus Allen won an MVP award and delivered the Raiders a championship. Tony Dorsett had his most productive years in Dallas early on in the 80s. Walter Payton stayed on top of his game late into his 20s and early 30s. In 1984, he broke Jim Brown's career rushing yards record. At age 31, 32, and 33, he remained an MVP candidate and was the focal point of the Bears' championship offense. But Eric Dickerson's entire prime took place in the 80s, and that prime is worthy of the 80s title. Payton, not having a decade to himself, sort of shows the flaw in picking players by decade. His overall career achievements top OJ and Dickerson, but those two had the luxury of their greatest achievements all coming in one decade, whereas Payton's career was almost split down the middle. For Dickerson, in his rookie year, he ran for over 1,800 yards on top of 400-plus receiving yards. The next year, he set the season rushing yards record with 2,105 yards, and that record still stands today. Before the end of the decade, he became the fastest player to hit 10,000 career rushing yards. Faster than Jim Brown and Walter Payton. Overall, he was a freak athlete with an iconic look and an all-time running back. 4 different running backs won NFL MVP in the 90s. Thurman Thomas played an integral part in the Bills' trip to 4 straight Super Bowls. To begin the decade, he led the league in yards from scrimmage for 3 straight years. Terrell Davis had one of the shortest Hall of Fame careers ever, but he made the most of those years, winning 2 Super Bowls, making 3 first-team All-Pro teams, and winning NFL MVP. Finally, although Jerome Bettis didn't win MVP, there's a reason he's known as the Bus. Now we have 2 Goliaths left in Emmitt Smith and Barry Sanders. Both of them dominated the 90s. For Smith, he led a 3-time championship-winning offense. In those 3 Super Bowls, he tallied 5 touchdowns, along with an MVP award. He won NFL MVP in 1993. He broke the season rushing touchdown record in 1995 with 25 TDs. And although it happened in the 2000s, Smith eventually broke Walter Payton's all-time rush record. And that record has never been touched. Meanwhile, Barry Sanders lived on the opposite side of town when it came to NFL riches. While Smith led a talented Cowboys team to success, Sanders attempted to lift the Lions out of the basement. He hit over 1,000 rushing yards in every year of his career. In 1997, he joined the 2K Club and won NFL MVP. His highlight reel is unrivaled. Watching him, it looked like he had a PlayStation controller hooked up to his legs. He could conjure up ankle-breaking jukes out of nothing. There's arguably never been anyone harder to tackle in open space than Sanders. So with that, he takes the 90s and has an argument for being the best ever. From 2001 to 2003, Chiefs running back Priest Holmes put together an amazing run that included breaking the season rush TD record. 2 years later, Shaun Alexander tied that record. Before we get to the next man to break that record, I have to mention Curtis Martin, who was Mr. Consistent his entire career, and Edgerrin James as well, who delivered big time on some elite Colts offenses. So now we're left with two. Marshall Faulk, the most talented piece of the greatest show on turf, and LaDainian Tomlinson, who broke that touchdown record and still holds it today. With Faulk, he's considered the best receiving back of all time. He had 4 straight years of 2,000 plus yards from scrimmage. One former NFL executive said Faulk could have lined up at receiver his whole career and still made the Hall of Fame. Peyton Manning said his ability to read defenses was as good as any quarterback. Now, Tomlinson's career began in 2001, and he delivered the Chargers 7 straight years of at least 1,200 yards rushing. In 2006, the year where he scored 31 touchdowns, he was named MVP. He could bounce off defenders, and once he made way for the secondary, it was a surefire home run. Tomlinson was also a receiving threat out of the backfield, and quite simply, a perfect weapon for the 2000s NFL. Marshawn Lynch was one of the toughest guys to bring down in the last 20 years. No better example than that than the Beastquake. Le'Veon Bell made defenses pay with his patience and receiving ability. Jamaal Charles was a game changer for some pitiful Chiefs teams. In the modern era, no running back has averaged more yards per carry. If he stayed healthy, then he would have been a surefire Hall of Famer. LeSean McCoy led the decade in yards from scrimmage and was as shifty as anyone in his time. In my eyes, though, there's no doubt that Adrian Peterson is the pick. Toward the end of the 2000s, Peterson had become the best running back in the league, and he continued that for the first half of this decade. With an ill-equipped passing game in Minnesota throughout his career, Peterson had to constantly overcome stacked boxes. In 2012, he rushed for over 2,000 yards and became the last running back to be named MVP. Maybe the most impressive part of that season is the fact that it came just 9 months after tearing his ACL. He was a pure runner and certified freak of nature. We still have a long way to go when picking for the 2020s. Nick Chubb has been highly efficient. Christian McCaffrey is certainly a contender. Unfortunately, his best season came in 2019, and he got hit with back-to-back injury years to begin the decade. So, thus far, I think Derrick Henry currently has the best argument with better health and his 2020 season being the last 2K Club breakthrough. So to wrap things up, hope everyone enjoyed this. Let me know who you think is the best running back of all time.